Welcome back everyone, it is Mike from ManaHoarders, bringing you another episode of Let Them Fight, featuring some of the new Precon commanders from March of the Machine. Now, as a quick disclaimer, these are not the real cards, these are in fact proxies we printed out, but these are in fact the deck lists of the new decks, so what we are playing is something you can expect to see if you purchase the Precons. Additionally, there are a lot of firsts for everyone at the table, including the plain cards that none of us have ever used before. Not to mention there are some brand new cards bringing some brand new abilities to the table, so mistakes will happen. Now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, we have Nick running Bright Palm, Dustin is commanding Gimbal, Damien is running Sidar Jabari, and I am commanding Brimaz Blight of Oreskos. I hope you enjoy this episode of Let Them Fight. And so the game begins with Nick winning the die roll. At the beginning of his upkeep, he flips the first plane of the game, taking us to the Megaflora jungle. He draws his card for turn, plays his land, and then passes the turn to Dustin. Nick taps 2 to play a Fractured Power Stone. He then taps it to roll the planar die. On a roll of a 5, nothing happens, and then Nick passes the turn. I pay 2 to cast a Knight's Whisper. I draw 2 cards, lose 2 life, and then discard down to hand size before passing the turn. Nick pays 3 to cast a Kodama's Reach. He gets a mountain onto the battlefield tapped and puts a plains into his hand, which he then plays as his land for turn before passing the turn to Dustin. Dustin pays 3 to cast a Saheeli Sublime Artificer before passing the turn. Damien pays 3 to cast a Commander Sphere and then passes. I cast my own Commander Sphere and then pass the turn. Nick taps his Fractured Power Stone to cast a Soul Ring. Nick then taps 4 mana to cast his commander, Bright Palm Soul Awakener. As the only target on his battlefield, he uses the backup ability on his own commander and then passes the turn. Dustin pays 4 to cast a Thopter Spy Network, creating a servo off of his Saheeli, and then he passes the turn. Damien pays 4 to cast his commander, Sidar Jabari of Zalfir, before passing the turn. On my turn, I pay 5 to cast a Shattered Angel, and then I pass the turn to Nick. Nick begins his turn by tapping his Fractured Power Stone to roll the planar die. On a roll of a 6, we are transported to another plane. We find ourselves in the Grove of the Dream Pods, and Nick resolves the Planeswalk ability. He flips an Emergent Woodworm off the top and uses the backup 3 ability to put 3 1/1 counters on his commander. Nick then follows this up by casting a Colonian Hydra. Nick swings at Dustin's Saheeli with his commander. Off of the trigger from the Emergent Woodworm, he gets a Forgotten Ancient onto the battlefield. Nick then resolves the Bright Palm trigger, doubling the number of 1/1 counters on itself. Dustin decides not to block, so Saheeli is disintegrated, and then Nick passes the turn. On Dustin's upkeep, he resolves the planar trigger. He flips cards from the top of his library until he hits a Schema Thief, which comes onto the battlefield. He then resolves the trigger of his Thopter Spy Network, getting him a 1/1 Thopter, and then he draws for turn. He plays his land for turn, so I gain 3 from my Shattered Angel. He follows this up by casting a Whirler Rogue, getting 2 more Thopters. He taps the 2 Thopters that just entered with the Whirler Rogue ability to make his 1/1 Servo unblockable. He swings his Servo at Nick for 1. Nick takes the damage, and Dustin draws a card from the Thopter Spy Network before passing the turn. At Damien's upkeep, he spins the planar wheel, revealing a Silverwing Squadron, getting it onto the battlefield. He plays a Myriad Landscape as his land for turn, and I gain 3 from the Shattered Angel. He then uses the Swift and Adventure ability from his Murderous Rider to destroy Nick's commander. Moving to combat, Damien resolves his commander's attack trigger, discarding a Knights of the Black Rose. Whenever he deals combat damage to Nick, he gets the Knights of the Black Rose onto the battlefield and becomes the Monarch. And during his end step, he draws an extra card while he passes the turn. At the beginning of my upkeep, I spin the planar wheel and land on a Meteor Golem. It enters the battlefield and I use it to destroy Nick's Colonian Hydra, and then I draw for turn. I pay 4 to cast my commander, Brimaz Blight of Oreskos, and then I pass the turn. From the planar trigger, Nick's luck continues and he flips a Shalai and Halar. He then resolves the Forgotten Ancient upkeep trigger and puts 2 1/1 counters on the Emergent Woodworm, which we forgot to actually deal damage from the Shalai and Halar, but we know the internet is forgiving, so it's okay. He also remembers that the Forgotten Ancient should have gotten the 1/1 from me casting my commander. He then follows this up by recasting his commander, using the backup 1 ability to put a 1/1 counter on Emergent Woodworm. We do remember the Shalai trigger, so he deals 1 damage to my face. Moving to combat, Nick attacks me with his Emergent Woodworm. Since it got backed up by the Bright Palm, it has its ability, so it doubles the number of 1/1 counters on it. He resolves the attack trigger, flipping a Triskelion, which enters with 3 1/1 counters, and then he deals 3 damage to my face. I block the Emergent Woodworm with my Meteor Golem, and Nick remembers to put the 1/1 counter on his Forgotten Ancient from casting his commander before passing the turn. At Dustin's upkeep, he gets a 1/1 Thopter from his Thopter Spy Network trigger. He then resolves the planar trigger and then flips an Everquill Phoenix, getting it onto the battlefield. He plays an island, so I gain 3 life from the Shattered Angel. He uses the Whirler Rogue ability to tap 2 of his Thopters to make his Schema Thief unblockable. He moves to combat and attacks me. I take the 3 damage and he makes a token copy of my Commander Sphere. In his second main phase, Dustin casts his commander. Nick's Forgotten Ancient gets a 1/1 counter, so he deals 1 damage to Damien's face. At Dustin's end step, he creates a gremlin from his commander's ability, and it gets 3 1/1 counters, which is equal to the number of differently named artifact tokens he controls. At Damien's upkeep, he resolves the planar trigger, revealing a Midnight Reaper, getting it onto the board. Damien begins his turn by casting a Promise of Loyalty. With that on the stack, Nick removes the 1/1 counters from his Triskelion to deal 3 damage to Damien's Silverwing Squadron. We then put Vow counters on all of our creatures, and then everything else is sacrificed. But since it is powered down, since the creatures are removed, and its power and toughness are equal to the number of creatures he controls, the Silverwing Squadron will die. Damien resolves his Midnight Reaper trigger, drawing 3 cards and losing 3 life. Since he cast a sorcery, Damien also rolls the planar die, but to no effect. Damien then pays 1 to cast a Soul Ring and then passes the turn. At the beginning of my upkeep, I resolve the planar trigger, revealing cards until I hit a Psychosis Crawler. I then draw for turn and everyone takes 1 damage, which it looks like Damien forgot. He then remembers that he was the monarch at the end of his turn and draws a card. I then cast a Phyrexian Rager, drawing a card and losing a life, and dealing 1 damage to each of my opponents from the Psychosis Crawler. From my commander's ability, I get an Incubator token with 3 1/1 counters, which is equal to the mana value of my Phyrexian Rager. Moving to combat, I swing my commander at Dustin for 3, he takes the damage and I pass the turn. At Nick's upkeep, he resolves the planar trigger, flipping a ManaHoarder Hydra onto the battlefield. Nick then casts a Guardian Scale Lord. He uses the backup ability to put a 1/1 counter on the Emergent Woodworm, and puts a 1/1 counter on his ManaHoarder Hydra from casting a spell. Before Nick moves to combat, I cast an Utter End, targeting his Emergent Woodworm, exiling it. With nothing else, Nick passes the turn. At Dustin's upkeep, he gets a Thopter from his Thopter Spy Network. He then resolves the planar trigger, revealing a Shimmer Dragon and putting it onto the board. Moving to combat, Dustin attacks me with his Schema Thief. It deals combat damage and he makes a token copy of my Psychosis Crawler, which turns out to be very bad. In his second main phase, Dustin recasts his commander. At the end step, he creates a gremlin and it gets 4 1/1 counters and he passes the turn. At Damien's upkeep, he resolves the planar trigger and gets a Locthwain Lancer. Damien then pays 6 to recast his commander, and Nick puts a 1/1 counter on his ManaHoarder Hydra before Damien passes the turn. I resolve the planar upkeep trigger and reveal a Mirror Battlesphere. It enters the battlefield and I get 4 1/1 Mirror. I draw my card for turn and everyone loses 1 from the Psychosis Crawler. I cast a Noxious Gearhulk, getting a 6/6 Incubator token from my commander. From the ETB, I destroy Dustin's Schema Thief, and I gain 4 life equal to its toughness. With nothing else, I pass the turn. Nick resolves the planar trigger, getting a Restoration Angel, but choosing not to bounce any of his own creatures. Nick then casts a Genesis Hydra with 5 into X. He reveals the top 5 cards and gets an Elite Scale Guard onto the battlefield from the Genesis Hydra trigger. He resolves the Bolster ability, putting 2 1/1 counters on the Guardian Scalelord, which is a misplay that none of us caught since it did not have the least amount of toughness. It should not have gotten the counters. Moving to combat, he swings the Guardian Scalelord at me since I have no flyers. I take the 5 damage and he gets his Shalai back to the battlefield before passing the turn. In response, Dustin taps 2 artifacts from his Shimmer Dragon to draw a card, and we all lose 1 from his Psychosis Crawler. At Dustin's upkeep, he gets a 1/1 Thopter from his Thopter Spy Network. He resolves the planar trigger, getting a Sandstep War Riders. Dustin draws his card for turn, and we each take 1 from his Psychosis Crawler. Dustin taps 6 to cast a Saheeli's Artistry, making 2 more token copies of the Psychosis Crawler. Nick puts another 1/1 counter on his Hydra and deals 1 damage to Damien. From casting his spell, Dustin rolls the planar die. He rolls a 1 and chaos ensues, meaning he gets a creature back from his graveyard to the battlefield, and he chooses his Schema Thief. At the beginning of combat, Dustin resolves his War Rider trigger, putting 4 1/1 counters on one of his Thopters. Dustin does not attack and then moves to his end step, creating a Gremlin and giving it 4 1/1 counters. Damien resolves the planar trigger and gets a Sir Conrad onto his battlefield. Damien then pays 5 to cast a Vanquisher's Banner, choosing Knights. Damien moves to combat and swings at me with his commander since I have no flyers. I go ahead and take the damage, but we do resolve his attack trigger. He puts Elenda and Azor into his graveyard, and then when damage is dealt, he gets them onto the battlefield. In his second main phase, he casts a Painful Truths, drawing 3 cards and losing 3 life. He plays a Plains as a land for turn, and then he rolls a planar die since he cast a sorcery. On a roll of a 6, we do Planeswalk, and we land in a Truga Jungle, which gives all of our lands tap and add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. At Damien's end step, he uses the ability from his Elenda and Azor, so he pays 4 life and creates 5 1/1 vampires since he drew 5 cards this turn. I begin my turn and draw a card, so everyone takes 1 damage from the Psychosis Crawler. Damien reminds me that I would have taken 1 more damage since he had Vanquisher's Banner out when his commander attacked. I begin my turn by casting a Keskit Flesh Sculptor. I follow this up by casting an Ichor Elixir. I follow this up by casting a Burnished Heart, making an Incubator token with 3 1/1 counters. To start Nick's turn, he casts a Mirror Style Master, using the backup ability to put a 1/1 counter on his Elite Scale Guard. Nick deals 1 damage from the Shall I trigger to Dustin. Moving to combat, Nick attacks me with the Elite Scale Guard and the Guardian Scale Lord, and he attacks Dustin with the ManaHoarders Hydra. On the Elite Scale Guard attack trigger, Nick taps my Mirror Battlesphere and attempts to tap 2 of Dustin's Thopter tokens. In response, he taps those Thopter tokens with his Shimmer Dragon ability to draw a card, and we each lose 3 life from Dustin's 3 Psychosis Crawlers. From the Guardian Scale Lord trigger, Nick gets back his Colonian Hydra. Since all of Nick's attacking creatures are modified, he gets token copies of them that enter tapped and attacking. Dustin blocks the 1/1 ManaHoarders Hydra token that entered, and then he takes 10. I block both of Nick's Elite Scale Guard and then take 8 in the air from his dragons. Since 3 total creatures died, each of us take 3 from the Sir Conrad trigger. Before Nick passes the turn, Dustin taps 2 of his artifacts to draw a card from the Shimmer Dragon, and we take 3 damage, 1 from each of his Psychosis Crawlers. Then he does this ability again, and then he does it again. Dustin draws his card for turn, and we each take 3 more damage. Moving straight to combat, Dustin attacks me with his Schema Thief and makes a token copy of my Psychosis Crawler, giving him 4 in total. Dustin then rinses and repeats, using his Shimmer Dragon ability to draw enough cards to deal enough damage to the table and win the game. And just like that, Dustin takes the win with his army of artificing aardvarks, or gremlins. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe, tell your friends about us, and leave a comment down below. Let me know what Precon you're most excited to get your hands on from March of the Machine. Thank you guys so much for watching, I really appreciate all of your support, and I'll be seeing you in the next one.